Welcome to this episode of The People Dividend. I am thrilled to have in the virtual studio today Dr. Britt Andreatta. And why am I thrilled? It's not often that we have an internationally recognized thought leader who uses and combines a background in leadership, neuroscience, psychology, and education to create science-based solutions for today's workplace challenges. Britt is the CEO of Brain Aware Training and former Chief Learning Officer, CLO, for lynda.com, for those of you who remember that, now, which has morphed to LinkedIn Learning. Lynda was the platform of choice. It was the platform of the future at a critical time in learning and development. So really glad to see how that has taken off and evolved. Dr. Andreatta has over 10 million views worldwide. Just let that sink in, audience. 10 million views worldwide of her online courses, and is the author of several best-selling books on the brain science of success, including Wired to Grow, Wired to Resist, Wired to Connect, and Wired to Become. And one of the reasons I'm so happy, and we'll have this in our show notes, and you can find out more about it, is that we are celebrating the second edition of Dr. Andreatta's book. It was released on May 19th, so just yesterday, folks, for those of you who are listening currently. Wired to Resist, the brain science behind why change fails, and a new model for driving success. I just have to go on, and this is because recently, just last year, 2024, Britt was awarded the ATD Thought Leader Award. She's been named as a top 10 influencer in learning and a top 20 influencer for leadership development. Dr. Andreatta regularly consults with organizations on leadership development and learning strategy, and I'm so glad to have the originator, the author, the pioneer of the award-winning Brain Aware Leader Training with us in the studio today. Welcome, Dr. Britt Andreatta.
Thank you, Mike. That's my bio, but the way you read it, I'm just kind of blushing. It made me feel really, really good. So thank you.
Well, I'm so glad that you're here. And tell us a little bit about, before we dig into your research on brain science, talk a little bit about the new origin story for the second edition of your book. What led to the new edition? What prompted it? Something maybe has changed, something's different. Let us know what prompted the new edition.
Yeah, no, great question. The original edition came out in 2016, and I just realized so much has changed. Through the pandemic, people went through an inordinate amount of change. Technology is accelerating. Human consciousness is shifting. There's a bunch of things that are kind of at play, and it really felt time to update the book. And particularly because humans, while always a little resistant to change, we've actually become more resistant to change recently. And it's playing out in all of the organizations I consult with. So I thought better bring some new updated data and some strategies for these current times that we're in.
So great. And let's explore that topic of resistance later on if we have time. But let's get to your research and what you've uncovered about using brain science to enhance change management and adaptability to change.
Yeah, I mean, the good news is humans are adaptive and resilient, but the problem is we first have this biological response to change, that we see change as potential danger. And we only really settle down neurologically once we get enough information, once our leaders, articulate a compelling future that we're moving toward and make it clear that we can get there. And in my research, I discovered that there's 4 specific brain structures that get activated by change. The first is the amygdala. That's our fight or flight mechanism. And it's the first one to respond like, oh, change, this could be bad. And it's designed to protect us. So it spins off into worst case scenario and all the things we could potentially lose, all the problems that could potentially happen. And if left to its own devices, it will really do that. Where if leaders articulate a clear narrative and a plan, it doesn't have as much, uh, information to kind of spin out on. The second brain structure is known as the entorhinal cortex, and it's your internal GPS system. It's how you get back to your house or the grocery store without looking it up on the phone. And so we have this map-making system in our brain, and if we go through change that requires us to move where we're working, this part of the brain has to create a whole new map. It creates physical maps in our brain, our mental replication of those maps. So we navigate space, and whenever we relocate someone, that part of the brain will make a new map, but there's some heavy lifting that happens. In addition, that part of the brain also maps social networks. And so we tend to pay attention to who has power in a situation or who we have affinity with. So whenever you reorganize a team or move a function under a different leader, this part of the brain has to do some heavy lifting because it has to rebuild all those social networks. The third structure is the basal ganglia. That's the part of our brain that helps us build habits. When we repeat a behavior over and over, it's that kind of automatic pilot we can go on. And change usually involves not only some kind of new habit that's awkward and uncomfortable, but oftentimes there's a well-grooved habit already in place. And unless we intentionally help people make it over the hump, they're going to default to the old behavior. And it takes on average 40 to 50 repetitions before we kind of settle into that new behavior. So that's an important thing to pay attention to. And then finally, there's the habenula. This is the part of our brain that tracks failure. And its job is to help us not make the same mistakes in the future. So when we make a mistake, it restricts dopamine and serotonin. It kind of takes away the feel-good chemical so that we don't make that mistake in the future. It gives us kind of a psychological motivation to not do that again. Well, most change has some sort of failure in it. Very rarely do change initiatives roll out on time and on budget. And so over time, leaders come into meetings and, oh my gosh, we're behind schedule, we're over budget, what are we going to do? And so all those employees are having the change coded as a failure, meaning they'll be more resistant to future change if it's not handled appropriately.
It's so great to see all of this brain science and its application to change management, our adaptability to change, and to also understand how it influences so many theories about people and culture that exist. I was thinking, for example, as you described the amygdala, about the fight-flight work and Wilfred Bion's theories in that area. And I remember being in Tavistock laboratories, working out, the social dynamics that were associated with power and authority in that context. And then I also reflect on the work that I did for a few years with Bob Keegan and Lisa Leahy on the immunity to change, and thinking about how all of that sort of can be explained in some ways by brain science. And to see its practical application, it's so interesting. And you mentioned early on about resistance, and this really leads into another question, which is, organizational change has always existed, right? It comes in different shapes, it comes in different flavors. But what's new and different about change now, Dr. Britt Andreatta?
Please call me Britt. Well, one thing that's always been true is our motivation for change is kind of dependent on two factors. So you can kind of think about your 4-square matrix. Do we choose the change? Yes or no? And do we want the change? Yes or no? So change that is put upon us that we didn't want, we're going to naturally resist and dig in our heels. A change that we sought out, like applying for a new job, and we got it, we want it and we got it, we're going to run toward it. We're going to have a lot of energy. And so we really can think about employees who are on the receiving end of change, how they feel about it, their level of motivation is going to determine how much leadership skills are required to get them through that change. So that's always been true. But what's new and different now is that change is coming at workers so fast and furious. And in fact, I've got some data points here to kind of really underscore this. Gartner did a recent study, and they found that the average employee experiences 10 or more organization-wide changes now per year. That's up from just 2 in 2016. Like, that's how much more change organizations are launching. And as a result,
That's
employee
crazy.
willingness, I know, I mean, it's just a huge jump.
Right.
And as a result, the willingness to embrace change has dropped from 74% in 2016 to now just 43%. And a big part of that was the pandemic. The pandemic was a lot of additional change that people had to go through in addition to all the changes they were dealing with at work. And both of these things, really drive change fatigue and burnout. And when people are change fatigued or burnout, they just don't have it in them to keep pushing forward.
It's been said that 2025 in human resources looks a lot like 2024 and 2023. That many organizations this year and many HR leaders are still coming to terms with post-pandemic issues, return to work, variable work locations. Some stay, maybe we're at the advent of the 4-day work week, with others say it's further on the horizon now. So many fundamental shifts in the way that we work, thinking about the gig economy and the advance of gig economies and how people put together careers with multiple jobs now. To also think about the decline in employee engagement, the persistent decline, the endemic nature of low employee engagement. I argue in my work that the only way to bring about change is with dignity, kindness, and respect. It's an adoption of humanistic values. Where does all of that fit into brain science?
Well, brain science actually proves that to be true. Humans are survival creatures. We're wired for 3 things. We're wired to survive. That's our need for food, water, shelter. But when everything's fine, that's our paycheck, because our paycheck is how we buy food, water, shelter. So we can activate a lot of survival things in the workplace. Our second big need is to belong. We want to be part of a community, but it turns out we're also wired specifically to be a tribal species. And so we're always paying attention to where we are in the group. And then our deepest need is to grow and learn and become our best selves. So all of those things can get threatened in the workplace, and why humanistic values really make a difference. But we also know that when we're throwing a lot of change at people, especially if it's not treated with those kinds of values, then it just exacerbates the resistance we naturally have to change.
For those of you who are thinking about the fall and fall conferences and searching for keynoters and thought leaders in this area of brain science and learning and human potential, make this a consideration on your list for the fall. Because we know that most change initiatives fail. The numbers go anywhere from 30% to 70%. If you took this approach that you're suggesting about a brain-based approach, what would shift around that failure rate?
We actually have hard data of this in the organizations we've worked with. So we have a brain-based change management framework that we roll out with organizations. And we've seen a huge shift because failure occurs mainly in 3 areas. There's a failure to launch. So there's just too much resistance to get the change up and running and get it off the ground. Then there's failure to sustain. So that idea gets launched, but it never gets sufficiently adopted to become part of the day-to-day work. And then the third type of failure is failure to scale. So the change got launched, it was sustained, but as the organization grows, it wasn't designed to grow with the organization. And so when we look at these types of failure, oftentimes it's that early resistance that just nips it in the bud right from the beginning. And so when you take into account the people side and how the brain works, it really changes how senior leaders need to design and announce change. It also gives very specific strategies for managers who are in charge of taking their group of people through, how they lead those folks through change. And there's even really empowering tactics and strategies that employees can use when they're on the receiving end of change to maximize their ability to lean in and also minimize their change fatigue and burnout, for example.
It's so interesting to consider all of these topics. And with advancing AI, where do you think we're headed relative to this? It seems that, I've presented at several HR conferences over the last several months on the topic of HR and AI, a new book chapter on that topic. Certainly, I think there is some wonder about whether it will create more work, less work, and how it shapes the world of work. What say you, Britt?
I think it has all of that potential. I think the fact that it's launching at the time we're seeing people so still depleted from what we've gone through, it's really marred or impacted its ability to thrive and shine the way it has the potential to. I want to say a little bit more about change fatigue, just so we can kind of wrap our head around it.
Yes, please, that'd be great.
Change fatigue happens when change is coming at us so fast and furious, we don't really get to settle into the new normal before we have to change more. And we can think about it as a continuum. At one end, you have engaged employees, then they become disengaged, then overextended, then change fatigued, and then burned out. So all of that exists on a continuum.
And change is happening at an accelerating rate.
Yeah, and if it's happening at an accelerating rate and it's also not managed well, so leaders are accidentally further, triggering our fear and our concern and all of that stuff, then people are just burning out their cortisol and their adrenaline all the time. And so change fatigue has these symptoms. People become disengaged, apathetic, emotionally check out, they're exhausted. You start to see a lot more absenteeism, more sick days, leaving work early. You start to see confusion, which leads to poor judgment and decision-making. Conflict goes up, so you'll see more tension between individuals and teams, and also cynicism, right? More skepticism, more resistance. If people with change fatigue don't get a break, then they cross over into burnout, which is a medically diagnosable state that often needs very intentional medical intervention to recover from. And the pandemic took the workforce and pushed it into high levels of burnout, which I'm still seeing play out, because the only real cure for burnout is rest and relaxation. And a lot of people still have not really recovered or even talked about the trauma that we all lived through. And so we're seeing that, intense emotional and physical exhaustion, even with physical symptoms. The second component of burnout is a lack of accomplishment. You start to feel this sense of futility that nothing you do makes a difference. And so people just start to really check out, or they feel like they need to change jobs. And then third is depletion of empathy. And you just don't have the ability to extend care or compassion for others or yourself. And worse, it kind of sucks joy out of everything that used to give you joy. So burnout can lead to diagnosed depression very quickly, because you literally cannot find joy in anything, let alone work.
Yes, so true. And as we think about the malady of burnout and its precursors, what does brain science teach us about managing and coping with change?
Yeah, I think for the first part, we need to talk about it. When I go into organizations and I just start to name what change fatigue and burnout are, people go, oh yeah, I'm seeing those symptoms in myself and my coworkers. So first we need to deal with that. When people are exhausted and at their limits, they're not going to perform well if you throw them into new situations. This is why we're seeing AI not achieve its full potential. It has so much potential, but it's overwhelming to people. So they're not getting to lean in and play with this tool in the way that I think organizations would like to see. It's also driving the real resistance to return to office mandates. But when people get a chance to recover and they can start to take care of themselves and recover from burnout, then they've got their gas tank is full of gas again. They have the ability to spend energy on these things. So I think it's really about talking about it, attending to it. And then I have found that when I share the principles of kind of a brain-based approach, leaders get it. They start to go, oh, if we just made a couple tweaks, we would set ourselves up for much more success. Managers get it. They start to realize how vital they are in helping people move through change. And so I think just talking about it and giving people some useful tools makes a huge difference.
So important to have this talk. And it causes me to consider, some say there's an increase in book titles around toxicity in management, toxic organizations. And clearly, I mean, given the nature of changes you've described, these 10 org changes a year that an employee may experience, also coupled, I think, with the erosion of middle management. I mean, most managers that I come in contact with are working managers. They have increasing spans of control for which they're responsible. So despite how well-intentioned they might be or are, their time for investment is limited. So how about your 3 to 5 practical strategies for driving successful change?
Yeah, so we think of giving strategies at every level of the organization. So we've got strategies for senior leaders, executives, strategies for managers, and strategies for employers. I'm going to hone in on managers. And I want to circle back in a minute to toxicity in the workplace because I have some interesting data on that. But when we think about kind of these 3 leadership roles, managers are oftentimes on the receiving end of the change. You know, they didn't get to design it. It's been launched, but they have to get their people on board with it. So we give them a set of tools. So there's some tools around the navigation of the change. You know, do we know where we're going? How are we going to get there? Do we have the resources to do it? And then we give them a set of connection tools, which is really about, can you maximize the connections and the authenticity of this team so that they're going through it together? This can become an activity that actually strengthens the bonds of a team, increases collaboration, increases connection, those kinds of things. So we want to make sure that you're doing it in a way that helps the overall team perform. And then finally, there are motivation tools, right? Because change is going to go off the rails at some point. No change ever unfolds like it's supposed to. So knowing how to read the signs in your people and knowing kind of which levers to push and what types of motivation are going to get them over the hump and keep them going, those are really the kind of very hands-on practical strategies that managers need when they are taking a group through change.
Now, when our audience picks up, they go to Amazon, they go to your website, brittandreatta.com, to pick up Wired to Resist, the brain science behind why change fails and a new model for driving success, they'll find these strategies and others, I'm sure, that you offer relative to building better organizations, helping people bring their potential to work.
Absolutely. In fact, you know, all of my books, I really believe in sharing data from huge global researchers like Gallup, McKinsey, Gartner. I pair that with the peer-reviewed scholarly journals from the neuroscientists, psychologists, organizational development specialists, and I synthesize them into kind of the why, what's going on and why this matters. But I always then end with hands-on practical things you can use today and start doing right away to really shift how things are going. And we've seen just really amazing results in the organizations we've worked with.
Well, that's great. And so wonderful to be in conversation with Dr. Britt Andreatta, author, speaker, consultant, developer of products and strategies designed to help you create better organizations, you to do better, to learn more about brain-aware training. You'll find lots of links in our show notes for today's episode. And Britt, I'd like to just once again thank you for being a guest on the People Dividend podcast. And if you were to leave our audience with one gem, one motivator for picking up the second edition of Wired to Resist, what would that be today?
You know, I work with talent professionals all the time, HR leaders, learning and development, et cetera. So I know that they are in the thick of change, and feel the pain of how much change is rolling out in their organization. So I think they'll want to pick it up. But what I would say is that in these talent roles, we oftentimes find ourselves responsible for creating success when we weren't necessarily at the table, or we didn't get a voice in the conversation as early as we would have liked. And I say we can still really bring value that drives, change and brings those metrics that matter in a way that's going to earn a lot of trust with the executive partners that you serve. So I think you'll find a lot of strategies that will really speak to you and help you speak the language and even convince other folks in the organization how important some of these efforts are.
Great. Well, thank you again. Really just delighted to be in conversation today with Britt Andreatta. And until the next episode of the People Dividend, stay well.